Our next speaker is a strategist focused on unleashing capitalism on climate change, and he's the co-founder of two organizations, the non-profit Rethinking Removals, which works in partnership with the UNFCCC Climate Champions, and the for-profit Curate, which partners with organizations to draw down carbon and store it using techniques such as direct air capture, enhanced rock weathering, oceans, forestry, and biomass. Please welcome Dr. Gabrielle Walker.
Thanks, David. Thanks very much. Can you hear me all right? Sounds very quiet up here. Good. So lovely to see you all here. I am here, as you just heard, to talk about carbon removals. Before I start doing that, I just want to give us a little quick romp through of a reminder about why we're here and why we actually need to care about emissions in the first place. I find it's helpful for me to do this, and hopefully it's helpful for you to do it as well. We just heard from the last speaker, the stuff about pizza, ha, 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 you're not taking this seriously. And this is a way to realize why we need to take climate action seriously. So let's have a look at it. So I've been working on climate change, God help me, for the best part of 30 years. Whenever I say that, I feel like I ought to apologize to everybody present that I haven't fixed it yet after all that time. I have been working hard. But most of that time, I've been working on trying to reduce the emissions that are going to the atmosphere, trying to stop the problem getting worse. And for most of that time, it really felt like it was an issue for tree huggers. If you want to be nice, if you like nature, if you want to be nice to the environment, if you're a nice kind of person, you ought to be wanting to do something about climate change. And then, just a few years ago, that situation radically changed. And it's something I've been working to try and make happen, and many others too. But this is what happened. It's summarized by this fine lady, Sarah Breeden, who is Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, who are not traditionally known to be tree huggers. And this is what she said last year. She said, climate risks are uncertain, but predictable. They will affect every consumer and every corporate in all sectors and in all geographies. I'll say that one more time. They'll affect every consumer and every corporate in all sectors and in all geographies. And that's why we're thinking about that now. That's why we're talking about it now. Because it's begun to dawn on more and more people, particularly in the finance sector, particularly in the business sector, particularly in technology and innovation, that this is something that goes everywhere. You can't just divest out of a single asset class. You can't move to a different geography. You can't just be a different person. It's affecting everyone, everywhere, all at once. And I don't have time to take you through all of that, but I just want to show you this one thing. So this is obviously a map of the world. And it's starting in 1880, which is the very beginning of the time when we started being able to have thermometers that measured temperatures right around the world. It's the ships of the British Navy, God bless them, were going all around the world with their thermometers, and they were measuring temperatures. Before that, we had individual, very long temperature records, but we didn't have global ones. So from 1880 to the present day, we've got a pretty good idea of how global temperatures have been changing. And the thing I want you to watch out for in this data, I'm going to show you a very short video. The thing I'd like you to watch out for is how variable our climate is, why it's so hard to pick out this signal among all the noise. So here it goes. So you can see that was quite a warm period in southern Africa, and then it's quite cold in that period, a bit of warmth up in the Arctic, and then cold for a while. Can you see how incredibly variable it is? It's gone warm again in the Arctic and then cold again. It's going cold again. That's why it's so hard to pick out this signal. It's going warm and cold all the time until you get to the 1970s and the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s and the 2010s. You see, the thing is, it really isn't subtle anymore. It really isn't subtle anymore. Climate change is now with us. And when I started talking about climate change all those years ago, it was quite hard to find pictures to illustrate what the scientists were telling us were coming. And now it's actually quite hard to choose which are the floods, the fires, the droughts, the storms that are already hitting us, which are the places where the letters are landing on letterboxes saying your home is no longer insurable against fire or flood, or your factories that are being flooded out, or the storms that are dramatically wiping out different parts of the world, including across the Caribbean. I just got one story about that, which is one guy. I was giving a talk to a bunch of retail investors, high net worth individuals, in 2019. And I showed a picture of a superstorm. The storms are getting more intense because of the extra heat energy we're putting in the atmosphere. And I showed it to him, and afterwards he said, you shouldn't have shown that one. You should have shown Hurricane Dorian, the one that's just gone across the Bahamas. And I said, why? Why that one? There's so many. And he said, I used to have a house in the Bahamas. He said, I don't anymore. He said, it looked like a nuclear bomb had hit it. And that's not a bad analogy, because the amount of heat energy that we're putting in the atmosphere is the equivalent to 4 Hiroshima bombs worth of heat energy every second. So I just wanted to bring that note of seriousness into what we're thinking about now. It's fun, it's fabulous. I'm going to show you some extraordinary technologies. I am beyond excited about them. And underlying it all is a mission to reverse the thing that we have just encountered. So this is the thing that happened in response. Starting in 2019, I remember I was talking to a bunch of very high-emitting business executives. It was across a different sector. They got together in a collaboration to try to figure out what their North Star for climate action should be. And I said, how about net zero emissions by 2050? And they all stared at me like I was a crazed hippie, which I've never technically actually been. But 18 months later, net zero targets were starting to spring up everywhere. It's got to the stage where if you don't have a net zero target, you're not at the table. And if you're not at the table, you're usually on the menu. And this is what it looks like. Last time I checked, which is last week, the net zero tracker tracking global net zero coverage around the world has shown that 92% of global GDP generators either have their own net zero target or they're operating in a territory that set theirs. This is utterly revolutionary. But most of those net zero targets are very kind of comfortably out in 2050, where you can kind of make the target and not worry about it anymore. So let's bring it a bit closer to home. In 2020, the governors of the Bank of England and the Bank of France then issued a letter to a whole bunch of CEOs, and here's what they said. They said, carbon emissions have to decline by 45% from 2010 levels over the next decade in order to reach net zero by 2050. in what I think is a big underestimate, they say this requires a massive reallocation of capital. We just saw the size of that number, but look at this. If some companies and industries fail to adjust to this new world, they will fail to exist. So, bringing it forward, that 45% is already looking a bit outdated. The European Union has set a 55% reduction target by 2030, and usually also has a plan to do it in its Fit for 55 legislation. So this is coming, this is happening, and most people have been focusing on the zero part of net zero, as indeed they should be. How do we get the emissions down? How do we stop the problem getting worse? Isn't it better not to put carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in the first place? Yes, it is. And it's utterly essential for us to turn that curve and get those values down. And that's the zero part of net zero. And you know about this. This is all the climate techs we've already heard about. I've exemplified that with solar and wind and so on, but it's all the techs. It's the increased efficiency. It's the climate techs that aren't just e-bikes and pizzas, but are actually going to the heart of how we decarbonize industry and so on. I'm not going to talk about those. I'm going to talk about the net part, what we do with the stuff that's left. Because this has had almost no attention. And in my opinion, this is the most exciting and one of the most important areas of climate action that exists right now. And I diverted, after all those years of working on carbon reductions, I diverted to working on carbon removals full time, and I'm going to show you why. So first of all, when you think of net zero, you think of the global carbon markets, and you think of this wonderful thing, CO2 neutral. Let's make my product CO2 neutral, let's make my farm CO2 neutral, let's make my factory CO2 neutral, then the job is nicely done. I can buy some cheap carbon credits just to balance any emissions I've got. I don't need to do all the hard work of doing my reductions. I can just buy credits, and I'm fine. And it's not exactly, is it? Because this started to happen. First of all, this is the Guardian article, more than 90% of rainforest carbon offsets of the biggest provider of a worthless analysis shows junk carbon offsets, junk carbon offsets. And so this has become a really toxic matter. Companies are stampeding away from buying cheap offsets because they're being attacked for it. And if you say that you're carbon neutral, you're just as likely to be attacked, or in the street, in a protest in the street, or to have a lawsuit brought against you. Those are happening with increasing frequency. You're not doing what you say. You have to be reducing materially. And what else do you have to be doing? So this is me. My name's Walker. People think it's funny that I do actually go on long walks. I got a lot of laughs when I was doing this one because it was the Camino de Santiago in Spain. It's 900 kilometers, 500 miles right across Spain. I did it in 2020. And every time I was checking into a hotel, if they asked me what my name was, if they spoke any English, and I told them Walker, they all laughed. But I put that picture up now because that was a pilgrimage of sorts. People go on it for all sorts of reasons. I went because I wanted a long walk. But in medieval times, it was a pilgrimage where if you walked the Camino de Santiago, you got your sins forgiven. When I was walking it, I was wondering if I should commit some extra sins along the way to get more bang for my buck. I didn't quite do that. But the reason I've got this picture up here now is in medieval times, if you were rich enough, you could pay someone else to walk the Camino for you. You pay them to walk it, they walk all the way. You, ladies and gentlemen, get your sins forgiven. What's wrong with that, eh? And that is what we've been doing with carbon offsets. It doesn't work. It was never going to work to say that we can just pay someone else to reduce so we don't have to. Instead, we need to think about what those carbon credits in the carbon market are actually for, what we're trying to achieve with them. And I've separated them out into 3 different kinds of credit. There's reduction credits. These are really important. These are credits that are helping global south countries that don't have the money to transform their infrastructure to stop burning fossil fuels, reduction credits. That's your cook stoves and the like. These are really important too, protection credits. This is stopping deforestation. And we need a much better way to do it than these kind of junk offsets that really didn't work because they were being measured against counterfactuals. It's very hard to measure something that didn't happen. And then there's removal credits. And removal credits are the things that take carbon dioxide out of the sky and keep it out. And if you look at those first 2, high integrity reduction, protection are going to be important. They're contributions, they're helping. But to take responsibility for your own emissions in your own net zero target, the only way you can do that is reduce your own emissions and remove whatever's left. Basically, net zero means what goes up has to come down. And the IPCC has said this, they're now calling carbon removals unavoidable for 3 reasons. First of all, we've left it too late to get to net zero quickly enough to keep 1.5 degrees alive. Secondly, even when we get there, we have to deal with very large amounts, billions of tons of residual emissions that we're not going to be able to stop. And thirdly, my favorite reason, reversing climate change. This is about not just stopping the problem getting worse, but actually fixing it. And this is one of the reasons that I turned to carbon removals, because it's the first thing in all those years of working on climate change I'd seen that actually gave me hope. So what do carbon removals look like? A very good way of removing carbon is planting trees. It still astonishes me that trees make their bodies entirely out of thin air, out of carbon dioxide. They're really good at it. Unfortunately, they take a while to do it, and also it can go straight back into the sky if they burn. So you've got to choose carefully where you plant the trees and how you plant the trees to make this work. But you can take the wood from trees and put it into buildings. That has 3 advantages. First of all, it displaces cement, which is a very big polluter in its own right. Secondly, it locks the carbon in as long as the building is there, so that keeps the CO2 out of the sky. And third, they're beautiful. This one's a Thomas Heatherwick one, but they are really lovely. And now there's multi-story buildings, very skyscrapers that you can build out of newly treated cross-laminated timber. You can also take wood offcuts and nutshells and the husks from rice and turn them into this stuff, biochar. You burn it in almost the absence of oxygen. It turns into this stuff that actually you can use as a fertilizer on fields, but the carbon stays locked in. It's called biochar, and it keeps the carbon out of the air. You can also take rocks, certain basalt rocks which exist all over the world. Naturally, they take up CO2, but it takes thousands of years. But if you grind them up very small and fine, and you put them on fields, then they take up the CO2 much more rapidly in 5 years, 10 years. And they also help the quality of the fields, and therefore they also help improve crop yields. You can do it in oceans. You can pump ocean water through, take out the CO2 that's in it and put it back out so it takes up more CO2 from the air. You can do this stuff, probably the most famous way in terms of machines, which is sucking air through big devices that capture the CO2 and literally put it in a blimp. And I rather like the poetry of this. It's kind of reversing the valve. You're putting it back where it came from. And this one's in Texas, in the middle of oil country. But this one is the one that the largest operating commercial plant for carbon dioxide removal from direct air capture at the moment. It's a tiny one in Iceland. They're actually growing the next size now. I put this in because I went to visit it, and honestly, Ladies and gentlemen, it's tiny, but it's so obvious. It's so obvious that this is what we need to be doing. And touching this place where the CO2 was going back into the sky, I touched the door. It felt like touching the first iPhone, because they're going to be everywhere. That's the other big advantage of direct air capture. You can do it wherever there's air, right? And this is what it looks like once you put it down into the ground. The one on the right there is fresh basalt, fresh lava, which is full of holes. And the one on the left there is after the CO2's gone in. In 2 years, it goes, it just mineralizes. It turns into rock, and it's never coming back out again. Fantastic. So these are the different types of carbon removal. These are the types of carbon removal that we actually sell. I said enhanced rock weathering, biobuilding, direct air capture, durable soil, biochar, trees, blue carbon. But at my company, Curate, what we do is we spread the risk by making portfolios out of those, because each of those has its own pathway to those billion-ton scale that we need, but you need to put them together to spread the risk, to spread the cost, and to spread the durability. And very importantly, you need to buy them in advance. We learned this through the whole process of vaccines. Instead of vaccine for COVID taking 20 years or 15 years to develop, it happened in one because governments around the world said, we'll buy whatever you make. And that was the R&D money that was needed to accelerate the process. And similarly, advanced purchase commitments are already starting to accelerate the getting the capital into the hands of the people who are doing these amazing projects. So here's an example of some advanced purchase commitments. Microsoft started this, saying that they were going to be carbon negative by 2030 and have removed all their historical emissions by 2050. The Frontier Fund came along, another bunch of tech companies with $1 billion fund to buy carbon removals in advance. Amazon got in on the act. NextGen facility, which is South Pole coupling with Mitsubishi. Airbus has been buying these in advance and wants to pass them on to different airlines. And JP Morgan. So this is starting, and this is the way that we're actually going to solve this, buying these things in advance. And I just want to mention some fun things about what we've been doing at Curate, because as well as selling carbon removals to corporates, we've also been removing from events. So our first client was actually the Queen. We removed the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. Disappointingly, our first client died, but we did remove her funeral. We are entrepreneurs. And then the next one we did, we removed the London Marathon. And we're going to have the first carbon-removed concerts at the O2, which is the 1975, which has got lots of the kids very excited. So this can happen now, and this actually shows that it's possible to buy now to be able to build this industry. So just as a recollection, net zero is about taking responsibility for your own emissions. It's about reducing everything you can and removing everything that's left. And I just want to leave you with one final thought, which kind of goes back to the thing I said at the beginning about why we're taking this seriously, why this actually matters. Because while I was in Iceland, I also went to visit this glacier. It's called the Ok Glacier, like OK. It's a pretty standard glacier in Iceland. It's right there in the highlands. You can only go in August. There's a very narrow window because the weather's so bad trying to get there. But I went there and I walked up to it because this is what it looked like in 1986. And this is what it looked like in 2019. It had gone. So I went up to visit it. I went to see it with a guy who's tasked with writing a plaque for them to use at the funeral they held for this glacier. They actually had a funeral. So the Prime Minister of Iceland and various other dignitaries actually climbed over the rubble and went up, and they put this plaque where the glacier used to be. Now, he's a poet. He had to decide 4 lines for what he was going to write on this plaque, and he decided to write a letter to the future. It says, a letter to the future. And I'm going to finish with this, and I hope you remember this, because this is why we are doing everything that we talked about today. It says, a letter to the future. Ok is the first Icelandic glacier to lose its status as a glacier. In the next 200 years, all other glaciers are expected to follow the same path. This monument is to acknowledge that we know what is happening and what needs to be done. Only you know if we did it. August 2019, 415 parts per million of CO2. We do know what's happening. We do know what needs to be done, and God help us if we don't do it. Thanks very much.